As we continue our week exploring the wild, reconnecting with our natural world, we are joined this morning by Sally Jewell, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior during President Barack Obama's second term from 2013 to 2017. While in this position, Secretary Jewell championed the importance of science and data, deepened our relationships with the indigenous communities, and worked to conserve our nation's natural, cultural, and historic treasures. One of the most notable achievements during her tenure was the creation of the Every Kid in a Park program, which allows any fourth grader and their families a free year-long pass to visit any of our national parks. I believe my daughter was in the fourth grade when that happened, so we were particularly grateful. So Secretary Jewell, before her tenure as Secretary of Interior, she was President and CEO of Recreational Equipment, Inc., REI, from 2005 to 2013. Since leaving government service, she has dedicated herself to working with the next generation of leaders in shaping a future that is economically successful and environmentally sustainable for all. Secretary Jewell has been recognized with numerous awards and honors, including the National Parks Conservation Association Winks Award for Public Service, the Woodrow Wilson Award for Public Service, the National Audubon Society's Rachel Carson Award, and the National Association for Corporate Directors Director of the Year Award. She is a global board member of the Nature Conservancy, and she serves on several advisory councils, including the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute and the University of Washington's Earth Lab. On a personal note, it was my great privilege to work with Sally during her many years on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association and to support her agenda when she served as Interior Secretary, which included the creation of 18 new national parks and monuments, protecting millions of acres of public lands. And advancing one of the largest renewable energy public land programs this nation has ever seen. So anyway, how cool is it to be able to create national parks and monuments? It is our honor to host Secretary Jewell and her husband Warren this week on their first visit to Chautauqua, made possible by the Robert S. Barger Memorial Lectureship and the Crawford N. and May Selstrom Barger Lectureship in Business and Economics. This morning's lecture is titled, America's Public Lands, Fuel Our Soul, Unlock Our Curiosity, Connect Us to Nature. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Secretary Sally Jewell.
Thank you, Mark. He is a climate champion. He was a climate champion for national parks, a climate champion for Chautauqua. Thank you, Mark. Well, I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the ancestral homelands of the multiple nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who stewarded these landscapes since time immemorial and who continue to have thriving cultures and communities in this region. And it's great to be here on a day where they are being recognized. So thank you for the warm welcome to your homelands. It's a privilege to be here. And I want to thank the Chautauqua Institution for bringing such a really interesting and engaged group of people together across such a wide range of topics, because we need time to think and to engage and consider our role in the world. So it's great to be among you, and what a beautiful place you have here. The other group of people I'd love to recognize this morning are people who have served the public, our public servants. Would you just mind raising your hands if you've ever worked in government at any level serving the public? Could we give these guys a round of applause? Thank you all. It is hard to serve the public. There's never enough money. There's always lots of demands. I know Chautauqua feels like a mini city. I know that they get some of those same demands, but thank you for everything that you've done. I got such a deep appreciation for public servants when I worked in government. So I'm going to launch into a lot of slides because it's about public lands, so you've got to have slides, right? And and I want to begin with just a couple of stories. The wide-eyed fourth graders from Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona stepped off their bus. They were eager to explore. The saguaro cactus jutted out of the vast landscape as we climbed up Signal Hill at Saguaro National Park. At the top, the rangers stepped aside, and the elders sang and spoke of the petroglyphs of their ancestors, carved into rock that showed travelers the way. The power of the children's connection to this place, their place, was palpable. And although just a few miles from their home, they had never been before. And the National Park Service rangers had never heard the stories and songs of the elders, descendants of those who stewarded those lands since time immemorial. It was a powerful moment. Then going west to the coast, after a boat trip, literally, that featured breaching whales and frolicking seals and porpoises, these children from the mountains across the mountains to California's Central Valley were so excited to be there. And they ran to me when I came ashore and said they'd seen one, the endangered Channel Islands fox, brought back from the brink of extinction. You see, National Park Service Ranger Monique Navarro, bilingual, bicultural, had spent months in and out of their classrooms teaching the children all about habitat and invasive species and threats to the fox's existence. They also knew that a nonprofit organization had bought a land that used to be a farm, and they'd worked with the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Game to remove feral farm animals and invasive predators, to repair the habitat so the fox and nearly 1,000 other species could thrive. The children will never forget that visit either. We all know, I suspect very much this crowd, how healing it can be to take a walk in the mist, to gaze at a sunset, to marvel at the Milky Way from a place far away from city lights. It's pretty good here too. I didn't see the Milky Way, but to stare at a woodpecker drill into a snag, or to be in awe of an old-growth forest, or the power of water that cascades over Niagara Falls close by. We seek nature in small and large ways. As a grandmother, you gotta sneak a few pictures in of your grandchildren, right? So this is 7-year-old Sawyer, Mount Rainier, with me. Because connections to the natural world nurture our bodies. They fuel our souls, and they unlock our curiosity. Theodore Roosevelt coped with the loss of both his wife and his mother on the same day, Valentine's Day, 1889. And he sought the healing power of Mother Nature in the Dakota Territory, recognizing its importance to his own health and well-being. And while the indigenous people of our nation could have provided important lessons about living in harmony with nature to Roosevelt and other presidents if those leaders had been willing to listen, Roosevelt's own journey was shaped more by people like John Muir and Stephen Mather and Gifford Pinchot, who helped him recognize the growing impact of uncontrolled exploitation by settlers on our nation's natural wonders. The decision near the turn of the last century to recognize the need for protection of resources, including the establishment of Yellowstone National Park 150 years ago, and I took this picture in the winter on an NPCA National Park Second Century Commission trip. They followed that protection 150 years ago of Yellowstone with Yosemite in 1890, and that was very unusual as a country. First national parks in the world were here. But because of those decisions and many more since that time, vast swaths of public lands were set aside, not just for kings and queens and nobility or the very wealthy, but for all Americans who collectively own about 30% of all the landmass of the United States, much of it in the West. The devastating floods in Yellowstone last month temporarily closed many parts of the park, impacting many of its 4 million annual visitors. But the good news is that they have many places and options of public lands to choose from in that region, while Yellowstone receives the attention that it deserves. The Antiquities Act, a law passed in 1906 during Roosevelt's term as president, protected the ancient Pueblo cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde from commercial exploitation, and they were being exploited, protected the Grand Canyon from mining, and many, many more places. This important law has been used by 18 presidents since it was passed. Only 3 have not used it. And the presidents that have been 9 Democrats and 9 Republicans, to address threats to our irreplaceable natural, cultural, and historic treasures. And more recently, voices from Americans who've been marginalized in the past are gaining influence and respect in shaping the future of public lands protection, resulting in new monuments that reflect the places and the stories of our complex history, both painful and proud. It was a privilege to work with President Obama on so many levels. But we also worked with so many dedicated citizens inside and outside government who played a critical role in bringing the nation's public lands to our attention in places that needed to be protected. Painful stories, like the Freedom Riders National Monument, which commemorates citizens, both black and white, who stood up for their right to ride buses and visit bus stations without regard to race, where they were nearly burned alive by the KKK when they attacked their bus in Anniston, Alabama, and blocked the doors. But it was the citizens of Anniston, Alabama, both black and white, that came to us and said, this story needs to be told. We don't want to walk away from it. We own this history. We want to move forward. Or Honouliuli National Monument in Hawaii, which highlights the shameful story of the Japanese American selective internment there, where history was nearly erased and the site reclaimed by the jungle because of profound shame for their internment, even though none of those people were ever found guilty of a crime. Or Stonewall National Monument in New York City, where the struggle for recognition and respect for LGBTQ+ people came out of the shadows and into new light, alongside several others that recognize our nation's bumpy journey to that more perfect union. And places rich in cultural history and natural beauty, like Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, sacred to 5 tribes whose ancestors inhabited these lands and whose history was being erased by looting and uncontrolled visitation on foot and vehicle. And you see the bullet holes in these petroglyphs. For the first time, management oversight of this monument will include representatives from those tribes, which is just great. And closer to here, Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, ancestral homeland of the Penobscot Indian Nation and other Wabanaki tribes in Maine, made possible through the generous assembly of 87,500 acres of former timberland, along with funds for infrastructure support gifted by Roxanne Quimby, the founder of Burt's Bees, to all of us, the American people. So I got to take a little boat trip down the East Branch of the Penobscot River with Lucas St. Clair, who helped his mom with the community recognize the value of this place to them and to all of us, bringing much-needed jobs and support to an area that had been suffering from economic hardship, as well as providing breathing space to visitors. So also protected are areas that you might not have an opportunity to see. George W. Bush protected Papahanaumokuakea, say that fast, Marine National Monument in Hawaii, and also the Pacific Remote Islands National Monument. Both were expanded by President Obama to go out to our whole exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, to the 200-mile limit. So why is this important, the remote Pacific Islands? And the answer is they were being overfished. The species diversity was plummeting. And I got a picture here I want to show you, put together by an organization called Global Fishing Watch. Every white dot you see is a fishing boat. You see an area on the lower part that has no fishing boats, and you see an island chain in the middle of it. That is Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. It matters. It matters. So when the world struggled from the Great Depression in the 1930s, in the US, President Franklin Roosevelt recognized opportunity in the healing power of nature, putting unemployed young men to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. They were all men back in those days that got the jobs. They learned new skills. They built trails that we use today. They built roads and bridges and lodges on public lands across the country, including places close to my home, like Camp Long in West Seattle, where I took my grandchildren to learn climbing on man-made Sherman Rock, where I learned to climb myself as a teenager. In 1936, segregated CCC crews built Chapawamsek Recreation Area, later renamed Prince William Forest Park, now a national park site in Virginia not far from DC, with 2 nature centers built for children that were separate but equal, where black and white children were segregated, but all had an opportunity to stay in bunkhouses, to gather in lodges around a large fire, to hike in the woods, and to learn to swim in pools created by water diverted from a local stream. The children were weighed each day. They were given nutritious meals. They learned about nature, and for many, they were nourished back to health both physically and emotionally after suffering severe privation. Post-World War II, some of those like me with gray hair will remember this, sought refuge on public lands to heal the wounds of war. You remember See the USA in your Chevrolet? There'll be some people that will remember that. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, very recently, we saw a similar surge as people flocked to public lands to seek refuge in nature as a break from cabin fever and the fear of the pandemic. So in 1959, when I was a 3-year-old, and this is me in a UK garden in Bristol before we emigrated, and I'm with my dad. He came to the US a few months before the rest of the family. And he asked his colleagues at the University of Washington, what do people do here? And he was told they camped and they hiked on abundant public lands. And then he was directed to learn how by joining a small Seattle-based co-op, REI. Member number 17249. So coming from a country where the crown controlled many places, the vast wild landscapes of the United States were a new concept to our family. I recall trips to Mount Rainier as a child, visiting national forests in the Cascades and the Olympics, seeing how many of my friends it took to embrace one of the many old-growth trees that were more common then than there are now. It's clear that adventuring on public lands was what helped define our new home, just as it has so many places across this great nation. My sister Jane and our friends experienced several incredible trips during childhood, led by Mrs. Black with the green circle in the upper left. I'm the other green circle in the front. She's now in her 90s and until recently was leading children to her local National Wildlife Refuge, Jewell, Washington. Over 3 summers, we got to explore the forests and learn the scientific names of the trees in forest campgrounds in the Cascades. We gazed at clouds in eastern Washington and learned their names. We visited archaeological sites in the desert. We mapped Obstruction Island in the San Juans. This is not my map. This is my friend Coe's. He's a much better artist. My idea was we create a band using kelp, cutting the horns to different lengths. And we gazed at myriad tiny life in the tide pools that Mrs. Black had us draw in our journals, all in the companies of grad students who taught us about nature. So it's an understatement to say that these experiences had a huge impact on my life and nurtured a deep connection to nature and a curiosity to learn more. I now have a very keen understanding of the privileges I enjoyed as a child that so few children had an opportunity to do across our country back then, and even more so today. Yet as a parent, and this is my kids with my dad, they were more scheduled than I was. in part because we were juggling work obligations and societal norms had evolved. While our children did play outside, we were more watchful of them than our parents had been of us. And our children's friends' parents were often, well, almost always, more worried than we were. And I even tried replicating what Mrs. Black did for me, but the complexity and the insurance requirements and everything else were so daunting I gave up. And I recall my son Peter's sense of isolation in his freshman year in college, now 20 years ago, when his dorm roommate had little or no interaction with him. And he couldn't find anybody interested in going out to the park to toss a frisbee around or go for a walk. I happened to be a regent at the university at that time, and we saw a steady increase in isolation and mental health challenges and suicides, especially among incoming undergraduate students. Dramatic contrast to the thriving sense of community we experienced nearly 30 years earlier, and where I met my husband Warren of 44 years, sitting in the audience. You can wave. That's it. The university did some research and realized that overscheduled children had limited skills to organize themselves socially. You think about it, not a surprise. But that's an essential talent to functioning in society. That was impacting the well-being of new students. So the university realized it needed to step up to structure programs to ease new students into building relationships and organizing themselves. So now as a parent himself, and this is when Sawyer was a baby and the bigs that came with their mom into the relationship, he finds now that the pull of technology and the screen has made it even harder for his children to connect with their peers in the natural world than it was for him. And the isolation and the increased screen time over the last 2 years brought about by the pandemic has just been really acute, especially for the older ones. So how do we get here? Well, one of the authors who's spent time talking at Chautauqua, a friend of mine, Rich Louv, helped me and others understand this when he wrote the book, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Yeah, he's great. Since written 3 more books. So he says that the reasons are complex and they're multifaceted, and we like to run and blame technology first, and I tend to do that. But we are afraid of bad things happening to our children. We get Amber Alerts, they remind us. There's expectations of academic achievement and expectations of testing into even preschool and kindergarten. There's organized youth sports. It used to be that you'd play multiple sports in high school for that season, right? And now it's like you're gonna join a select team, you're gonna play year-round, you have to do it to the exclusion of other activities. And here's a fact for you. 98% of young people who play organized team sports in school, when they graduate, become spectators. 98% become spectators, only 2% continue to play. So what did they sacrifice? Lifelong activities. Hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, tennis, golf, swimming, cycling, you name it. And then many of them are being introduced to that for the first time when they get to college. And so technology, of course, it's engaging, it's entertaining, it's essential in school. We have it in our pockets right now, but it's also addictive. And peer pressure draws us there. I look at my granddaughter, Emmy, who scrolls a long time on TikTok, and that's what her friends do, and they, up each other on who saw the best little video, but it's keeping them tied to the indoors. And parents who let their children play in a park might be accused of neglect if they're not there watching their every move. And I think we all recognize that, and there's maybe some examples here, that affluent children may be overscheduled, but they have access to places to get away. But there are many, many kids, the majority of kids, whose parents juggle multiple jobs. They have financial insecurity, and they may have little supervision or safe places to play after school, and that can keep them indoors and isolated. So during my time at REI, we recognized our business depended on healthy and accessible outdoor spaces and engaging the next generation in the joys of nature, especially from communities and circumstances whose traditions did not provide many opportunities to experience the natural world. So we created some fun stuff, the Kids' Passport to Adventure, the PEAK program, promoting environmental awareness in kids. We took it out to middle and high school students in English and in Spanish. We reached 500,000 youngsters. We did some research, though, and we recognized that in order to really unlock that curiosity, it had to go beyond a field trip or a fun outing. It had to be deeper and more impactful. And what was encouraging then and continues now is there's a lot of people that have stepped up to help to recognize this need. First Lady Michelle Obama worked tirelessly on the Let's Move initiative and child nutrition programs. And we captured that and took Let's Move outside. Took a lot of young people outside. Rich Louve's work spawned the Children in Nature Network, and I encourage you to go out to that to look to some practical tips on how to get children and families outdoors. Another hero of mine is Rue Mapp, who created Outdoor Afro. She lives in the Bay Area. It's now nationwide, creating outdoor clubs for African Americans eager to share the outdoors with their friends and family. She invited me on this float trip down the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities with an Outdoor Afro outing. And there's lots of trips like that around the country. And then nonprofit organizations like the Trust for Public Land, focusing on bringing parks and green spaces to all Americans within a 10-minute walk, and that's both urban and rural. And so many others, creating organizations like Latino Outdoors and the Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps, and so many more. And while the CCC hasn't been recreated, we're blessed with hundreds of organizations around the country and in every state, like this group I worked with in New York City. It's the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Conservation Corps. And after Superstorm Sandy, they worked on recognizing that so many of the natural spaces that protected parts of New York during Superstorm Sandy could be recreated. And in this case, they are planting native species to absorb the next storm's fury. So everywhere I've been across the country, volunteers are stepping up. This crew in the Great Smoky Mountains is just one example of the 10 volunteers in the National Park Service, 300,000 annually that come out to the parks to help supplement the resources. How many National Park Service volunteers out there? I imagine there's a few. Just a few, okay. It's a great opportunity. It's like Chautauqua, only free. So when President Obama tapped me to serve as his Secretary of the Interior, I realized I had both a platform and an opportunity to accelerate connections between millions of young people and the natural world, lifting up the work of so many dedicated people and organizations like those I mentioned. So we created a continuum to engage people in nature, children in nature, and it focused on 4 areas: play, learn, serve, and work. So the continuum begins with play. Everybody likes to play. It makes us kids again, right? Just let children play outside. Well, we raised some money from largely the American Express Foundation in this case, and we engaged the YMCA, which serves 6 million children a day in daycare, and AmeriCorps, and we launched a multi-year national effort in partnership with urban areas, 51 of them, and land management agencies to bring outdoor experiences into the lives of over 10 million children. The next is learn. The best classroom, in my view, is the one with no walls, and Mother Nature is an incredible teacher. So we worked across government with the Department of Education to take disparate programs, random acts of kindness, and begin to focus them on the one age that the experts at the Department of Education told us we should, and that was the 4th grade. Stole a little of my thunder, but that's okay. It's an age where children are eager to learn, and they're also easy to reach because most of them still have homerooms. So that's when we launched the Every Kid in a Park Pass, bringing every 4th grader in America a free pass for their family and their friends onto public lands. And it also enabled the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service and the Forest Service and the National Park Service and others to focus their limited education resources on that age group. And those opening examples I used from the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona and the children in California's Central Valley came from that program. But here's my favorite picture from that program. President of the United States, next one. President of the United States went to the Everglades to deliver a climate change speech. He really wanted to go out on an airboat, and the Park Service was going to take him, and then a thunderstorm came overhead, and the Park Service said it was too dangerous. So I was over on the Anhinga Trail with these fourth graders who had been studying why the Florida Everglades are so important in protecting the landscapes there against climate change. They act as a giant sponge. The wetlands close to shore act as a buffer from storms, and the children knew all about that. And they said, "Oh, the president's here. Can we meet the president?" And I said, "I'd really like you to be able to meet the president, but I'm sorry, he's going to be giving this speech. He's on an airboat tour." Well, then the president shows up, which was pretty cool. And the children taught him about climate change in the Everglades and why it was so important. Gave him great material for his speech on climate change to come up, but it was just so exciting to see it. So when my immediate successor threatened to eliminate this program as too expensive, Congress responded overwhelmingly by codifying it into law. So, bipartisan support for children and nature. What's not to like about that? Every fourth grader will have this fun rite of passage, and I hope it truly does become a rite of passage from them. So that's learn. Serve is next, and that's engaging youth in volunteer service and facilitating partnerships with land management agencies to welcome these trusted Conservation Corps partners onto their landscapes. This is a service project in Anacostia Park in Washington, D.C. It's about the size of Central Park in New York City, but it's not quite as nice. It's overseen by the National Park Service, and I'm working here with a group of Girl Scouts. They were very excited. They were seeing birds' nests in the bare winter branches. They weren't so excited about all the junk and garbage that had washed up on the shoreline that we were cleaning up, but they recognized what happened to garbage when people didn't put it in the right place. They were pruning branches that had grown across the bike paths to bring in natural light so it wasn't so dark and scary. And I'm confident that these girls will never look at Anacostia Park the same way. And with their help and community advocacy, maybe it can be a park like Central Park for this disadvantaged area of Washington, D.C. So these focused efforts to support service on interior lands tripled the number of volunteers to over 1 million annually. But more importantly, it deepened these young people's connection to nature. And the last is work. It put careers on their radar that they wouldn't otherwise have had. If the CCC could change the lives of 5 million men, today's political climate when government programs aren't popular, it's programs like this that support this work, that enhance public lands and they deepen the connections. So again, we reached out to the private sector, American Eagle Outfitters, REI, Coca-Cola, and more, to fund paid positions for young people to work on public lands, like these girls who are helping collect fish and other species in the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon to support science on what happens with high flow releases from Glen Canyon Dam. Or these young people working with USGS scientists monitoring fish and stream quality. And time and again, I speak with public servants, and many of them started their careers with a start on a Conservation Corps crew. And they recognized how fulfilling it could be to work in nature and share that experience with others. But my comments to this point have been all about human needs, nature in service to us. So I just want to switch gears for a minute and talk about how important nature is, not just for us, but for all living things. There's an increased understanding and awareness of how interconnected our natural world is, and how Western science and understanding has only scratched the surface of recognizing the importance of biodiversity and how it shapes the very future of all living things, including us. Through conversations I've personally had with people who are connected to the land and water, from indigenous communities to farmers and fishers and foresters, they share with me the changes they've witnessed over the course of their lives in plant and animal health, like the misalignment in phenology between pollinators and plants. This picture I took in the Arctic of the melting pack ice causing massive erosion. And a new phenomenon I was told about, Arctic rain. It only used to snow. And that rain freezes on the surface, preventing caribou and other animals from foraging beneath, resulting in starvation. We also see the disappearance of fish and streams and offshore that used to host abundant life. Traditional indigenous practices of regular burning of excess brush have given way to decades of fire suppression and increased fuel loads. And you combine that with more weather extremes and people moving into fire-prone areas, and we see unprecedented destruction from wildfires, including the desert Southwest this year, with fires burning so hot that all life in the soil is destroyed. We see coral reefs bleaching. We see wetlands essential to habitat to avian and amphibian and aquatic species, while also sequestering massive amounts of carbon, are drying out. And I never expected as Secretary of the Interior to be dealing with wildfires in Florida, but they're a huge issue, and sometimes they burn for years in the peat that has dried out. We know that humans have had a profound and cumulative impact on our planet, primarily the consequences of over 150 years of burning fossil fuels and releasing various greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We know we couple that with clearing land for agriculture and development, and we release sequestered carbon and eliminate habitat, all in support of economic progress. But I'll say it's not all bad news. We as a species are innovative and intelligent and adaptable. And it's going to be essential that we actually use all that talent to address what we face, creating the enabling conditions so we can pull carbon out of our atmosphere, stop damaging essential ecosystems while changing our sources of energy to stop adding to the problem. Nature is a key part of that solution. And around the world, there's growing urgency and recognition of the need to put protections in place to maintain the ecological integrity of the intact natural places that are most vital to our planet's health. There's a saying we have at the Nature Conservancy, protect the best, improve the rest. Right? Protect the best, improve the rest. So how can this be done? Well, it comes from aligning the interests of these places with the economic interests of the people who live there. So this is a picture of the mouth of the Klamath River. In this area, states and tribes and farmers and a major utility work together to remove dams, to restore salmon runs, and support sustainable forestry and tourism. There's a massive effort that went all the way to Congress and got defeated by Congress on the Klamath Basin Plan, but it's still going forward with dams coming out. So that gives me hope, and this was a drummer on the Klamath River when we came together hoping that that legislation would pass. So there's a movement around the world to protect 30% of our planet's most valuable natural places by 2030. So this is a screenshot of National Geographic, January 2021, when President Biden announced that the U.S. commits to tripling its protected lands. Here's how it can be done, it says. So this is a USGS map. You can't see it, but anything in color belongs to the American public. There's obviously a lot more of it in the West than there is in the East, but there's places increasing in the East. And while all of those don't have sufficient protections for what I'm talking about 12% of our public lands do, we have the opportunity to do it in a way that is more advantageous and easier to do here, frankly, than other places. So getting to 30 by 30 is a big lift, but we've got a good start, especially if we create ways to pay for the value we receive for clean air, clean water, and carbon sequestration that these natural areas provide, so we can align our economic interests with our environmental interests. So I just returned from the Pacific coast of Vancouver Island. You won't be able to read these words, but the Nature Conservancy board met there, and we were immersed in a project they'd been working on for 30 years, protection of the Emerald Edge. And if you can see that green swath, it is 100 million acres that runs from the Tongass National Forest in Alaska down through the Olympic National Forest in Washington State, where I live. And it is the largest intact coastal rainforest in the world. So this effort has been going on for decades, as I mentioned, and they protected the Great Bear Rainforest and supported a major effort to bring indigenous land stewards there as rangers, forest rangers, to protect these landscapes while also driving increased visitation and tourism. So at the board meeting, this young woman, Jewell from the Talokwiat First Nation in Tofino, led a rainforest tour for the TNC board, and this was just a few weeks ago. And she said, I'd love to see us change the concept of land use planning to land care planning. How profound is that? It's a beautiful restatement of one of the responsibilities of government in shaping a sustainable future. So in this case, tourism, fishing, sustainable aquaculture done right, sustainable forest management, all can provide jobs while retaining ecosystem integrity and nurturing indigenous cultures. So a few more examples from TNC. They are working with Syngenta, a large agribusiness company, with farmers in the area on regenerative agriculture, so that the most lucrative economic future for farmers and ranchers is through using existing agricultural lands and not deforestation to economically grow food. And that's happening in the United States as well, with thought leaders showing the way to introduce regenerative agriculture in the Midwest, improving crop yields while also sequestering and measuring carbon in the soils. And one more example, in places as diverse as Colombia, where I've been and seen this project in action, or Croatia, or Kenya, or the United States, TNC is working with water users downstream to create funds where they pay upstream water landowners to maintain watershed integrity, to create economic incentives to keep forests and habitat intact, ensuring a healthy water supply downstream, and that is a lot cheaper than building treatment plants to purify unclean or silty water. In my own community of Seattle, we are flanked on the east side by the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, and the Wilderness Society launched an effort with an economics firm to look at the value of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest to the region. They said it was $1 trillion over 100 years in ecosystem service benefits that residents like me receive through clean air and water and reduced need for infrastructure like reservoirs and treatment plants, quantifying the benefits that we all receive from public lands like those in my backyard. So the key to making sustainable progress is understanding those areas that need protection and coupling that with the alignment of economic interests and environmental outcomes, which are not at odds with each other. But it takes collaboration across multiple sectors of society to get there. So where do we go from here? And you can all play a role, and I hope you already are, or that you will. I guess one of the benefits of age and experience is you begin to see kind of how all the pieces fit together. I've been a business person all my life, except for my 4 years in government. From my early days as an engineer working for Mobil Oil, extracting oil and gas from the earth, to nearly 20 years in banking, working with renewable and non-renewable natural resources, timber and fishing being 2 of those, manufacturing, agriculture, real estate development, and more. So I've worked with lots and lots of businesses, and I've personally witnessed being a party to the impact of our economic activities on the environment. But I've also been an active volunteer, and this is an organization that I've been a part of for close to 30 years, over 30 years actually, the Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust. So it brought together diverse voices from our region, both sides of the mountain, saying, this I-90 corridor that runs through a beautiful area, let's just make sure that it doesn't look like I-70 out of Denver. It doesn't have to be developed all the way. Let's protect the intersections from development. Let's allow economic activity, but let's do it smart. Land care planning, to quote Jewell. And over 30 years, this effort has had an enormous impact on our region. It's been positive economically. It's supported growth and economic activities, but it's preserved hundreds of thousands of acres of forests, mountains, and streams for habitat, wildlife corridors, carbon sequestration, and recreation. And even as I-90 has been upgraded, we've put in wildlife crossings. So when I moved to REI in 2000, I struggled with the fact that our customers wanted places like this to recreate and renew, but we weren't sure the impact of our business. and whether we were having an adverse impact on that very environment. And every business should be facing this right now, if they haven't already. So when I took over as CEO, I said, we got to understand what our impact is. And this is from those days, 2005, a group of folks from REI saying, what is our impact on the biosphere? And we needed to move from random acts of kindness, like don't use plastic bottles, to things that are much more impactful. And this is a busy slide, and I took out all the builds and just put it up in one thing. There were 5 areas we focused on: climate change and energy, paper and forest products, waste reduction, recycling, green buildings, and products. And it was very, very difficult. But we recognized there were government policies that put us at a competitive disadvantage, and we worked with government at every level to help align the interests of the environment with those policies that we had, things like waste and recycling availability. When it came to the product we sold, we were too tiny to have an impact on factories, but if we banded together, and we did with the American Apparel and Footwear Coalition, 60% of all the clothing and footwear produced in the world, we could actually have an impact, and those efforts are moving forward. And since I left REI to serve the public in 2013, they've made great progress, and I'm enormously proud of them. Today, they have continued to bring their carbon down as their business has grown, and they've offset those emissions that they couldn't do directly. So they are net zero. And they're also creating a new line of business, which is re-commerce. It's taking that gently used stuff that's sitting in your garage and reconditioning it and selling it at a significantly lower price to make it more accessible for people to get into the sport. So across my business career, I learned that thoughtful regulations, we heard a little bit about this yesterday morning from Bob Inglis, they're essential to business success. Regulations are not the enemy of business at all. Think of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, both passed during the Nixon administration, that were a reaction to air you couldn't breathe, to rivers that caught on fire from industrial pollution, to things that we could really see. And these were supported by a wide bipartisan margin and have been instrumental to cleaner air and water we enjoy today, including many improvements to coal-fired power plants that prevented acid rain and more recently reduced carbon emissions. So this is a vista from Great Smoky Mountains National Park that's far clearer today than it was 30 years ago because of these efforts. And Mark had something to do with that too. He filed a lawsuit when he was at NPCA to stop development of a coal-fired plant. And it's very unfortunate that just last week, these protections are weakened by the Supreme Court regarding reducing the EPA's ability to regulate power plants and their harmful greenhouse gases. And I think that may be because now we take our cleaner air and our cleaner water for granted, and you can't see CO2. But we got to get back to that. So in general, responsible businesses don't mind playing by the rules. They really don't. They just want the rules to be predictable and not change all the time, so they can make smart long-term investments. But what's really difficult is when the rules keep changing, like an ideological pendulum that swings in different places, and we've seen that a lot in recent years. So I acknowledge public servants at the front end of this. It is much more difficult to be a public servant than it is to run a business, even though we revere business people and we tend to vilify public servants. Serving the public with its interests that span the geographic, ideological spectrum is very difficult. It is about listening. It's about taking in multiple points of view. It's about upholding the law. And frankly, it's about crafting the best solution possible, not by focusing on our points of difference, but by focusing on common ground to create policies and practices that stick. And I also know, regardless of ideology, people want a healthy environment for future generations. And that includes protecting natural places and connected ecosystems. So I've got a few examples of just some of these that we worked on in government. This is called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. There's a lot of sun in the Mojave Desert of California, and there's a lot of wind. It's also migration corridors for bighorn sheep that hope to be reintroduced. There's places like Joshua Tree shown in the picture. There are lots of conflicting interests, including sacred sites of tribes. We deconflicted those and zoned It's a dirty word with some, but land care planning. Where should the solar and the wind farms go? Close to transmission, already in disturbed areas. And oh, by the way, if you go to those areas, utilities, we will expedite your permit and you'll have it within 90 days. That's money for the business. It removes some of the risk. It drives development to the right areas, and it maintains those ecological corridors that are critical. We did the same, well, this is one of the solar farms, and this happened to be on the Mawapa Band of Paiute Indians in the Mojave Desert. We also did the same off the Atlantic with offshore wind. Learned from the mistakes of the Gulf of Mexico and the oil and gas drilling and what has happened, not even going into Deepwater Horizon, but what's happened by the development without recognizing the ecological integrity we needed to protect. So offshore in the Atlantic, we did that work in advance. And first steel in the water happened just off of Block Island in Rhode Island. And it is now taking off. So that first lease sale we did competitively got about $1 million because there wasn't any infrastructure. The most recent one, close to $1 billion. So it's taking off, and it's going to bring clean energy to these giant population centers just east of here. Yeah, it's good. Clap for that. And then across the Great Plains and the Great Basin, we work with ranchers and energy companies and environmental nonprofit organizations and states usually don't find all themselves in a room together agreeing. But we wanted to prevent the extinction of an indicator species, the sage grouse, the greater sage grouse, while allowing development to continue. And this is someone showing a map of where the sage grouse roams. When you take care of the sagebrush sea ecosystem and you reduce the fire risk and you take care of that habitat, you help ranchers and you help farmers. And the miners and the others that want to develop the lands can see where they need to go and where they need to avoid, which expedites their process. And I saw a Republican governor from a very conservative state about 6 months after I left office. And he said, "God, I miss you, Sally." And I said, "Really? You know, you got the House, you got the Senate, you got the White House, like what's to miss?" And he said, "They're revisiting our work together on sage grouse. And the oil companies are coming to me saying, we thought we had a deal." Because I think the subsequent administration didn't have a roadmap other than to try and undo what we did, even if it was done the right way. But you know what? Those oil companies and the other developers know where to go and they know where to avoid. So the work sticks, even if the government that follows you doesn't. So another part of society, and I'm sure many of you are involved, is in nonprofit organizations. And, you know, in business, I did everything I could to avoid getting sued. Well, in government, I got sued 3 times a week. And occasionally those lawsuits came from Mark. Not very often, though. More often, they came from organizations like Wild Earth Guardians or the Center for Biological Diversity, usually involving endangered species. And I do remember coming to my team saying, "What do I do when I agree with a plaintiff?" And while the courts can be overused, and I didn't like all the suits that were v. Jewell, and neither did my husband because we share the same last name. They all went to v. Zinke when I left, so that was good. But I came to deeply appreciate the value of nonprofit organizations and the importance of using the courts and holding government accountable for upholding laws, while also pointing out that some of those laws have flaws and need to be updated because they're not serving their intended purpose. And when citizen activists like Greta Thunberg make us uncomfortable, like when she asked those of us in positions of privilege and power how we dared maintain the status quo while the very future of life was in peril, we better pay attention, because she's absolutely right that the comfortable decisions of our past have charted an unsustainable path forward that will severely impact her generation and those to follow unless we act. We all aren't activists, but the activists say what needs to be said so that those of us that may be more collaborators can take action. So whether we are motivated to become activists or collaborators or on-the-ground stewards or public servants or business leaders, it's essential that we all engage as citizens in making the case for the importance of sustaining the natural world around us. This happens to be a public meeting we hosted It had about 1,500 people at it. 400 there were room for inside, and the other 1,100 were outside in over 100-degree temperatures around Bears Ears National Monument. All of this is hard work, but it's rewarding because it sticks. And if people feel respected and part of the process, they look beyond ideology to their own long-term interests. So I want to wrap up with a story about how I regained my own balance after the 4 most intensive years of my life. On February 1st, 2017, Warren and I loaded up our car, we left our home in DC, and we began a 3-month, 10,000-mile road trip across the country to our home in the Pacific Northwest, and we wanted to slow down and catch our breath. So we started by going south. It was February, right? That was a smart choice. Not too many people here in Chautauqua probably in February. We immersed ourselves in the African-American journey, from enslavement to emancipation, Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow era. We met people who are working hard on the fight for civil rights, which is very much still ongoing. This is in Birmingham. I like to say we did handbrake turns at brown signs, dropping in on national wildlife refuges, historic sites, and other public lands. We spent weeks immersed in the natural beauty and thousands of years of history in the desert Southwest and its ancient Pueblo inhabitants, the descendants of whom are still here, keeping up many of the traditions of their ancestors, including Deb Haaland, current Secretary of the Interior and a member of the Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. So there were 60 sites we visited in all, and we concluded our immersion at Bears Ears National Monument, special place that I referenced earlier that President Obama protected, then President Trump unprotected, then President Biden reinstated. It's a place where these 5 tribes, some historically nomadic and others agrarian and historically have not always gotten along with each other, got together and put those historical differences aside and advocated for protection of this beautiful and sacred landscape that was being looted and overrun with uncontrolled visitation. We hiked with a guide into cliffs where dwellings were artfully built many hundreds of years ago, leveraging the benefits of winter sun and summer shade and access to water, where granaries were built to store corn through the winter. We saw sandals built during the basket maker period, likely unearthed from ancient burial sites. They were beautifully crafted about 1,200 years ago. We saw another pair of sandals, 400 years newer, coarsely woven. Why were they 400 years newer? Because the art of weaving and fine basketry for carrying water had given way to a new innovation, pottery. There's so much to learn from how people lived in harmony with the landscapes and how they continued to innovate to live within their surroundings, just as we need to do today. Our trip was also an opportunity to reflect on our nation's journey and how we shape a path to the future that is economically successful and environmentally sustainable, a future that we're proud to leave to future generations, and where biodiversity and wildlife can continue to thrive alongside a growing human population. Because even if we don't understand it, it's true, we need them. Public lands and natural places are going to play a starring role in the United States, and we are blessed to be in a good place to start. So I want to conclude by encouraging each of you to think about your own gifts and talents and how you can be part of the solution, reconnecting people to the natural world and respecting the role the natural world must play in our collective future. And as I learned over the last decade, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Your voices are more important than ever today, and I encourage you to speak up, to vote, obviously, but to make sure your elected officials know where you stand, to thank them for their service, because it matters. And perhaps more importantly, most importantly, take the children in your life and in your communities into the outdoors, especially those who may not have had the opportunity. Let them explore, let them play, unlock their curiosity, and teach them what you've learned about the wonders of nature, because they will become tomorrow's elected officials and activists and scientists and public servants, farmers, fishers, workers, business people, and the volunteers who will shape our future. And their experiences will help shape where nature and the environment fit in, just as my early experiences shaped mine, and I suspect happened to you too. So I'm going to leave you with my favorite proverb that I thought of often when handling the conflicting and complex decisions I faced as secretary, but would have equally applied to my time as a business executive. We don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So I ask all of us to consider our earth and what we can do now that will make our children proud. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Jewell. That was wonderful. I know for those of you who are leaving for other programs, because we're very busy here at Chautauqua, we ask that you do so quietly and out of respect for those who are staying behind as we transition to the Q&A. If you have questions for Secretary Jewell, you may submit them through our ushers who are circulating and can provide slips of paper and pencils. You may also submit questions online at questions.chq.org or on Twitter via the hashtag @CHQ2022. And Sally, before the first question, I wanted to just reflect on Anacostia Park, which is my family's local national park and where our daughter grew up playing soccer. And those volunteers have done an amazing job. I go there today and we see egrets, we see bald eagles, we see osprey. Even wild turkeys have returned. And in fact, they've returned in such numbers that they are terrorizing bikers and hikers on the Anacostia Trail in a good way. But there's some funny videos on YouTube if anybody wants to look them up. I've been chased, I will say, and it's pretty interesting. But I want to start with a question. I'm drawn to the notion of how public lands fuel our soul. And this is a sentiment that connects with two speakers that we will be here on the stage on Thursday, Terry Tempest Williams and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I know that you know both. In Refuge, an unnatural history of family and place, Williams writes, quote, "If the natural world was assigned spiritual values, then those days spent in wilderness are sacred. We learned at an early age that God can be found wherever you are, especially outside." In a similar vein, in Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer writes, quote, "For all of us, becoming indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it." As Interior Secretary, you are a steward of some of America's most sacred lands, places that I know give you great personal fulfillment. So can you comment how Williams and Kimmerer have influenced how you think about the meaning of public lands?
How many of you have had an opportunity to read Braiding Sweetgrass? A lot of you, that's just terrific. So Robin's going to be here. Her book is terrific, and it is a bridge. It's a bridge between Western science and indigenous knowledge, and it's her own journey from taking a plant apart into its component parts, which is what we do in Western science, and we give each of them a Latin name, to the language of the indigenous cultures that talks about actions in nature, not just breaking things apart. It's a brilliant story that leads us to what I've been talking about, which is what we have done to the landscapes, not with malice, but what we need to do to heal them. And I think it's extraordinary. So I encourage you to go to her literary program. It's a great book. And for Terry is a brilliant writer, great work. She's also an activist. And I think it was one of my first meetings as Secretary of the Interior she was being friendly and happy and nice, and then she basically said, and you need to protect 2 million acres in Utah, which basically is Bears Ears National Monument. So we did. It took a little while longer and probably not fast enough for Terry, but she was banished from the University of Utah, so Harvard picked her up. Because she was taking young people from the University of Utah out to mine sites to actually see the sorts of things that Robin talks about at the end of her book, places that many companies would rather you not see, that need to be seen so that we all collectively understand the impact that we have on our environment through the products that we use and so on. So Terry's going to be here in this place, I think, on Thursday morning. I encourage you to come and listen to her too. But both very influential in different ways, and both, I think, bring incredible gifts, literary gifts, that help us all understand our place.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Thank you for your wonderful blueprint to save the world. Please tell us more about the fact, science basis for your decisions, and how best to counter the current culture of facts not based on scientific truth.
I had to tell you a story of my own naivete. When I left government, within a, no, actually, it was right before, it was after the 2016 election, but before President Trump's inauguration. I spoke at the AGU, American Geophysical Union. It's a gathering of like 25,000 scientists. And I was asked, do you think we need to protect our data from this administration? And I said, I can't imagine that. We'd have to protect the scientific data that we've been accumulating over 100 years, which helps us understand climate change and so on. I mean, I just can't imagine with the public servants that I know and so on that those could be under threat. Fast forward about a year, I was doing some work with another nonprofit, and I was in a hotel in Virginia, and someone from the USGS was there and met me and recognized me in the lobby. So we exchanged our niceties, and I said, what are you doing here? And they said, we're here with an international conference of scientists working on creating parallel tracks to protect all scientific data because we're worried. And they were right to be worried because there are those that would like to erase the facts so that they can continue to do things that they believe are in their economic interests without regard to the future. There are definitely people like that. Some of them ended up in the Department of the Interior. So I think that, as our speaker yesterday morning said, I think that there is a growing understanding and recognition of climate change because we see it in the news every day, right? And people may not call it that, and Catherine Hayhoe, who's the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a conservative Christian, also says you got to bring it down and don't use inflammatory words in different communities just to talk about what's happening locally, and I think that's something that we can all do, and it is important. But science has been under threat, and it is important for all of us to stick up for it, and to stick up for organizations like the Union of Concerned Scientists that brings these issues to light. And I was relieved to hear these scientists say we are protecting the world's data in multiple places in open source so that that data can be acquired no matter where people are around the world, because I think the data in the US was vulnerable.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Last year, David Turner wrote in The Atlantic that we should return national parks to the tribes, making America's best idea even better. On this Haudenosaunee Confederacy Day, do you see ways forward for this kind of return of public lands to Native communities?
Short answer is yes. I think that it's a relationship that needs to thrive, to grow and develop, and there's so much that we can learn from indigenous communities about how to live in harmony with the landscapes and also unlock the stories that have been locked up and that we haven't been able to learn from because we haven't been willing to listen. We did start this process. The Chickasaw National Recreation Area is co-managed basically with the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma. In the Wrangell St. Elias National Park and adjacent BLM land in Alaska, the Otna community, which is kind of in that Athabascan central Alaska area, we worked with to do wildlife management. Wrangell St. Elias is giant and it's not, overrun with tourists. It doesn't have roads and access, but it does have animals that are being hunted mostly by hunters from Fairbanks and Anchorage, not subsistence hunters. And they said, this is critical to our subsistence. And so the challenge there was getting the state to sign on. Bears Ears is a good example of tribes coming together, and there are other areas. So I think you got to bring public land managers along, and that starts with listening, and it starts with employment and bringing people from Native communities in to have employment. Another great example in Glacier Bay in Alaska, where the Hoona Indian Association, Hoona, Alaska, and it was the ancestral homelands before the Little Ice Age there, of those people are working closely with the Park Service. They've now got a longhouse. The Park Service paid for it. It was created by indigenous artists, and they are now the interpreters there. So it's happening in steps, and I think it needs to accelerate, and I think you're going to see more of that. And those 5 tribes working on the management plan for Bears Ears will be a really important step in that direction. Now that's Forest Service and BLM, it's not Park Service, but all of them are learning from this, and I did a secretarial order on co-management of public lands that began to get some traction, and I think Deb Holland is taking that forward in even more so. So it won't be revolution, it'll be evolution, but it starts with opening the doors and listening respectfully, and I believe that's happening.
Thank you. Sally, I know you got to spend some time yesterday with Bob Inglis. I'm sure would love to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation. And but I also know as a business person, I'm sure that there are many perspectives that you share. And so we have a couple related questions. Can we have environmental sustainability and economic health, especially if we have this constant growth mentality? And related, can the free enterprise system solve the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff I agreed with Bob about yesterday. And I do think you can have both. I think we must have both. We've got to align economic interests with environmental interests. And it's tricky because there are consequences. So if you think about a carbon tax, which he talked about yesterday, putting a price on carbon is essential. We are releasing gases that we don't see into our atmosphere that are having a profound impact on our climate. We know that. And what Bob didn't talk about yesterday was we're already on a trajectory to be in deep trouble. We're going to continue to warm this planet for years to come unless we can start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So he talked about the importance of planting trees. That's certainly part of it. But we've got to use that innovation and the skills to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And there are ways to do that, but they've got to be, they're funded by a price on carbon. So that mechanism needs to be put in place so it becomes economic to unlock the power of the private sector. I don't think it should be done or could be done as effectively by the public sector, by increased taxation and so on. I think you've got to align those incentives. Water funds, like I talked about, the value of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. What the USGS put on my radar is ecosystem services. Okay, it's a buzzwordy term, but it basically recognizes that in Seattle we get value out of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. Our water is very clean, and it comes from the mountains and the Cedar River watershed, which is owned by the city, and it's in that Greenway corridor I talked about, is fiercely protected. And that's because long ago, when that was created, the city leaders recognized what a great job nature did in providing clean water. So we're going to have to start recognizing that and paying for it. And maybe it results, New York City did this too. They actually have great water in New York City because they paid for, upstream watershed protection. And I'm sure that's reflected in the water bills in New York City. So those kinds of things that align economic interests with environmental outcomes are super smart, and there are many, many places around the world where that can happen. Colorado River is in deep trouble right now, over-allocated. You've seen probably the articles on Lake Mead shrinking and, dead bodies being found, after many years and other things. We have not aligned the economic interests. People are taking as much water as they can because they have authority to take it without regard to the fact that it's damaging everybody's ecosystem, and that will have to change. And people are going to have to start paying what the water is worth, and that will begin to change their behavior. So I do think that there are pathways forward, but we all have to advocate for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I'm afraid I mistimed the Q&A, and clearly this is a topic I could talk about forever. So that was our last question.
Oh, okay.
And,
sorry, I talked too long.
No, it was my problem with the timing. But Secretary Jewell, Sally, I would just want to thank you again for this wonderful, wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Yes.
See you on the back porch.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.